So, this time we are going to have a discussion between very, very important, interesting speakers. One is Hugh, the philosopher, specializing the ethics of war, and the counterpart is a professor from Japanese Buddhism. So, and yeah, we do that practice, philosophical practice, elevating each other to create something new. So, from your perspective, what do you expect to see after the discussion? So, you have been working around ethics of war in this age of full of conflict and war. Yeah, of course. So the conflicts and war have existed any time, but now we are facing the polarization and also fragmentation. And so, what can we see when we mix the philosophy around ethics of war from your side, and also the different view from Buddhist philosophy?
Well, so I'm really excited to see what we can make of this, because for me, this is a very new experience, and I'm also still learning, a lot about Buddhism and Buddha Dharma. So I think it's going to be, for me, a little bit of a leap into the unknown. So very, very, very exciting. But we've structured this discussion around 3 different ideas or anchor points. So the first one is the idea of rights. What are rights? What are human rights? What do they? How do we? Why do we have them? And how do they function? Second is around conflict, and third is around reconciliation.
Yes.
So we've really thought of this discussion as something of a journey through these 3 different interconnected ideas or domains that I think each have slightly different meaning and resonance between these different traditions. And I think for me, really wonderful outcome will be if we are each able to really come from this dialogue with richer understanding of each other, but also of our own way of thinking about these ideas and our practice more broadly. And as I said, as I kind of mentioned before, I think, for me, it's been really particularly useful and challenging to really have to reflect on some of these very, very deep assumptions that we have, certainly within Western ethics. So, for example, that desire satisfaction is itself always an intrinsic or prima facie good. And when you have Buddhism come along and say, well, desires may actually be, a form of illusion, a route to suffering, that really forces you to step back and say, okay, so, to what extent is this commitment to desires, does it really have the right place within our view? So I'm really looking forward to that process of really reflecting and questioning and learning. And of course, why do we choose those themes of rights, conflict, reconciliation? It's exactly because those ideas are very relevant to the world we have at the moment, with very terrible conflicts in Ukraine, in Israel, Palestine, in Sudan, and other parts of the world. the need for these kinds of ideas of how we uphold human rights, how
Right.
we avoid and mitigate conflict, how we move towards not just peace understood as ceasefire or ending hostilities, but really peace as reconciliation, of building the structures of being together in a way that is peaceful and supporting of justice. That is needed more than ever. And then also, I think, particularly being in Japan, I spoke earlier about my sense growing up as the descendant of two ancestors from Germany and the UK, Jewish and German. That sense of having to go through the work of reconciliation from past conflict. And my sense is that's also a very important question still today here for Japan, thinking about its relationships with its neighbors, for example, with China, with Korea, where it really feels that there is still work to be done, really on both sides, to achieve that kind of deeper reconciliation.
Yes, certainly. So, um, let me let me have some time. Yeah. So yes. So I think in this polarized world, so the ethics in war must be facing a new phase. I mean, so the conflict and war basically was mostly between nations or among nations, right? Nations state basis. But now, so in this polarized world, so the people on your counterpart or might not may not necessarily share the same human rights value, So we need to face a total stranger sometimes. So yeah, it is very difficult but important to make a way to face in these this situation, right?
Yeah, and of course, one of the things that makes the ethics of war so difficult is that ethics, the possibility of ethics, the possibility of just ethical behavior and interaction also has social conditions, right? So we understand that to have a peaceful, law-governed society, you need a kind of appropriate social conditions and legal structures to make that possible. And one of the things that makes ethics in war so difficult is that almost all of those structures are absent, almost by definition, right? You don't have a single society, you don't have a single authority applying the law. So there's this kind of fundamental paradox. How can ethics even get started? How can it even become meaningful in this situation where, as you say, you're facing a stranger or an adversary that seems to be so fundamentally opposed to everything. So and that to me is one of the things that makes the ethics of war so fascinating, because you have to think about how can you even get this project going in this kind of case. And I do think it's possible to get that going. There are really important resources that we can draw from. To me, they have really importantly to do with the idea of human rights. And we can talk about how to understand this idea of human rights in a way that can make it applicable even to these contexts of war. But it's also, you mentioned the kind of transition to conflicts with enemies who might not be states, but might be irregular forces or guerrillas. And the truth is, we've had situations of conflict like that many, many times before in the history of war and conflict. So these things they're a little bit more like a cycle than they are like a fundamental fundamental change or new direction. So and certainly the way that I think about the ethics of war. So this is a view that's come to be called revisionist just war theory.
Yes.
So why revisionist? So revisionist means that thinkers like myself and others in this tradition, we start to think very much from the position of the individual. So we don't think first about the relationship between one state and another state. We think much more about, okay, what does an individual soldier owe to another person that they're facing, maybe across a battlefield, across a line of sight, that other person may be a soldier, a combatant, maybe a non-combatant. And the question we're asking really is, how should we view the rights of those two parties, the soldier on one side, soldier combatant, non-combatant on the other side, and what does that tell us about the permission to use or not to use force? Now, one of the things that I think is helpful about that way of looking at things, not looking at the kind of big scale of one society against another, one state against another, but really saying, okay, let's look at the status of individual soldiers, individual civilians, and what can we say about what they owe each other, is that it matters much less actually about whether the war is a war between two states or a war between a state and a non-state party, or between two non-state parties, like two criminal gangs, for example. The basic mechanisms, I would want to say, they're the same. They're the same. And so it's not so challenging whether we're in, civil war or guerrilla war or traditional war. Lots to say still about that. Lots of really important questions, particularly about how you enforce those kinds of obligations, right? So how you create not just an ethics of war, but really a law, a reliable, consistent, implemented law of war. Very, very great, very, very great challenge. But I think it really starts from thinking about some of those more basic, conceptions, which for me really importantly starts with human rights.
Thank you for sharing. So we are reaching to the end of the podcast. So let me ask this question. So the Japanese Buddhism have a very good, interesting tradition to have a ritual ceremonies for to remember our ancestors. And I think it's, in my understanding, it's not just about remembering, but also punctuating the relationship between two parties. So the people living today and the people who had passed away. And we then we can refresh where we are, and we can move forward. So my question is, for the future generation, so for us to become good ancestors for the future generation, personally, what do you want to leave as a legacy for the future generation, and also, what do you want not to bring to the future generation? In other words, what do you want to stop in our generation, not to bring it to the future? So, what do you think of it?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And so I think clearly for me, very, very important part of that is around conflict and creating the conditions for us to have more peaceful world and relations with less conflict. And I'll tell you another story actually about another kind of ancestor, intellectual ancestor. So I ran a conference many years ago in 2002, I think it was, in America. And we were very fortunate to have with us the last surviving prosecutor from the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War in Germany. So Nuremberg trials were the the trials that were held by the victorious parties in Europe to prosecute the members of the Nazi regime for crimes committed during Germany. And Japan, you had Tokyo trials. In Europe, you had the Nuremberg trials. And so we had the last surviving prosecutor who had been, young military lawyer at the end of the Second World War, and was really given the task to prosecute Himmler and Goebbels and Goerings, these very senior Nazis. And just extraordinary story. And the body of law that was crafted in Nuremberg really became the foundation for modern international law. And I remember he gave this talk to us, 200 or 300 of us, all lawyers, philosophers, other academics working in the ethics of war. And he said, I and my generation, we were the first wave of modern international law of armed conflict. Then in the 60s, 70s, there was a second wave where you had Geneva Conventions, you had the beginning of what became the Rome Statute and the birth of the International Criminal Court. So that was the second great wave that really built out and developed this idea of international law. And then he looked at us in the audience and said, and you're all the third wave, right? So now the baton is passed on to you. It's your job now to take this and to build on what we've done and to build better structures, better laws, better institutions to prevent conflict and to mitigate them and to create more justice.
Wow.
So I think big part of, our responsibility, my responsibility, other colleagues and people who work about this and care about this, is to really take that role seriously. And I think there are really two components to that. One is a kind of philosophical, so really deepening our understanding of these ideas, like the ideas we're talking about these next few days, human rights, ethics of conflict, reconciliation. But second really important part is building institutions, right? Building structures, building organizations, building laws that can help to create more just institutions. So when I think about my work, I think that's something I would very much like to leave behind to our descendants, or leave for them. But leaving behind is a really interesting question, and I think also really, really important one. So I think there are clearly many things that we need to stop as a society, and I think perhaps most important is destruction of the natural world, and clearly carbon emissions and climate change is a huge part of that. And I think if we have not managed to leave behind that practice of highly carbon intensive economy and activity, I think this will be looked on as a profound failure and a profound crime, actually, from our generation. But it's not just climate action. I think it also is around destruction of habitats and ecosystems. Humans clearly are living in a way that is not sustainable for the world, and I think that is something we clearly need to leave behind. And again, I think that depends on creating institutions and structures I think it's a collective challenge. I don't think it's something that can be done by any individual alone. So it really is something, again, that we have to work to build those connections, build those structures, build those institutions to enable us to do that. So those are two, very, very big, very ambitious things. But I think there's also clearly a very just personal dimension as well. We want to, I guess, through our lives and through our livings, show a kind of humility to learn and to become better at loving each other and being tender with each other and sustaining with each other. So I think, yeah, I'd very much like to be able to, in a small way, leave behind something in both of those ways.
Thank you for sharing your beautiful stories and your thoughts, profound thoughts. Yeah. So So in this world, we have been only focusing on human beings mostly, and so the right has been around human, but we need to expand the realm of rights to a broader sentient beings, right? So let's see how the meetings between West and East will come out. Yeah. So thank you so much for joining this podcast.
Thank you, Shippy.